Okay, Robert's manning the microphone. If you have something to say, he'll try to get it to you. Crowd's down a little bit this morning, but we've got quality people here for sure, not quantity. Do you having trouble hearing? Can Okay, is that any better? I'll try to speak a little louder. Okay, we're in our series called Wow Moments in the story of Jesus. And we're to lesson 9. Last week we kind of had a special lesson, so we kind of put something in our outline that wasn't planned to be there. So last week we talked about the resurrection of Jesus, which was certainly a wow moment. But today we want to get back to our outline, and we're going to talk about the Sermon on the Mount eventually. We got a few things to do before we get there. But Sermon on the Mount, and your outline says that's 1 week. It's probably going to be 3 or 4 weeks. That is a transformative teaching, so we're probably going to spend more time on that. So, we're in the second year of Jesus' ministry. It's a year where his popularity among the common people has really soared. But it is also a year where he has raised the anger, the ire of the scribes and the Pharisees by proclaiming his divinity and by healing on the Sabbaths. And they are beginning to make their own plans to destroy Jesus. Now, in this current chapter, Jesus continues to heal the masses. He appoints 12 apostles, and he continues to teach the multitudes with transformative instruction, which will be readily apparent when we start studying the Sermon on the Mount. But before that, we need to talk about a few things that we didn't get covered before the Sermon on the Mount, and that's in Matthew 10 and 12, Mark 3 and Luke 6, where Jesus heals many by the Galilean Sea. He appoints 12 apostles, and he teaches the multitude. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, Jesus had just healed the withered hand of a man on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees became so angry that they began to plot how they might destroy Jesus. Matthew 12:15 says that Jesus knew how angry that the Pharisees were, so he just withdrew from them. Mark 3 verses 7 and 8 says, "But Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the sea, and a great multitude from Galilee followed him, and from Judea and Jerusalem, and from Idumea, and beyond the Jordan, and those from Tyre and Sidon, a great multitude. When they heard how many things he was doing, came to him." So the multitudes came to him. And that certainly is a wow moment to see all the people from all over many nations beyond Galilee coming to Jesus to hear him. Now, having heard about the many works of Jesus, these great multitudes came into Galilee. And they came from Judea and beyond, and they flocked to Jesus in great numbers. The numbers were so great that Jesus told his disciples to prepare a small boat on the water to which he could escape should the crowd begin to crush him. In particular, with so many being healed, those with afflictions pressed about him just for the opportunity to touch him with the hope of being made whole. And according to Mark 3:11 and 12, Jesus healed some with unclean spirits. And the spirits would proclaim, "You are the Son of God." But Jesus warned the spirits. He sternly warned them. And he also warned some that he had healed, according to Matthew 12:16, that they should not make him known at this particular time. Mark 3:8 indicates that non-Jews from Idumea, from Tyre, from Sidon, and beyond the Jordan, or east of the Jordan, were in this multitude of people flocking to Jesus. This is perhaps why Matthew 12, 18 through 21 repeats the prophecy from Isaiah 42, 1 through 4, which predicts that Jesus will declare the truth of the gospel to the Gentiles. It is Jesus that Isaiah refers to in verse 18 of Matthew 12 as my servant and my beloved. And it is Jesus upon whom the Father says, I will put my spirit upon him, and he will declare justice to the Gentiles. The prophecy describes Jesus as meek, peaceful, and compassionate. And according to Matthew 12:21, in his name, Gentiles will trust. And that's another wow moment, especially for us, since we would be considered Gentiles outside the realm of the Jewish nation. Now, Luke 6:12 indicates that Jesus went out to a mountain to pray, and likely to have some solitary time away from the crowds. And he spent all night in prayer to God. And when it was day, he called his disciples together, and from them he appointed 12 men to be his apostles. Apostles that would stay with him and continue with him, and apostles that he might send them out to preach on his behalf. He also gave the apostles power to cast out unclean spirits or demons, and to heal all kinds of sickness and disease. And that is a wow moment for those that he appointed. If you remember, he had just started casting out the demons, and here he gives the apostles the power to cast them out as well, and to heal all other diseases. Now, the names of the 12 apostles were Simon, whom Jesus also named Peter, and his brother Andrew. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, whom Jesus named sons of thunder. Philip and his brother Bartholomew. Matthew, the tax collector, who was also called Levi. Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus. Lebbaeus, whose surname was Thaddeus, and he's also called Judas, the son of James, in Luke's account. Simon the Canaanite, also called the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who would betray him. And Mark 3:19 says that they, after he had called them to be his apostles, that they all went into a house. It doesn't tell us why, but I think perhaps it was for further instruction by Jesus. We should also note that in all likelihood, Luke 6:17 through 19 is the same event that we have just described, where a great multitude of people from all areas surrounding Galilee came to hear Jesus and to be healed of diseases and unclean spirits. Now, Luke places this event after Jesus appoints the apostles, and Mark places it before the apostles were appointed. And as we've mentioned previously in our study, the gospel writers were not so much concerned with chronology, and for that reason they're prone to placing events somewhat out of chronological sequence. Okay, any comments on what we've just covered? If not, we'll get to the Sermon on the Mount. And this is in Matthew 5:1, and it goes through chapter 7 and verse 29. It's also covered in Luke 6:20 through 49, not covered in as much detail. And we're also going to have some miscellaneous scriptures where a lot of the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount is repeated. So, we find the setting of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5:1 and 2. And it says, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. Then he opened his mouth and taught them saying. So the multitudes that Jesus saw could very well be the same crowds that we just finished talking about, who were still following after Jesus. And seeing the multitudes gather, Jesus went up on a mountain, probably near Capernaum. And he found an elevated spot. In all likelihood, that seemed to be his practice. It doesn't say that, but his practice was to find an elevated spot. And he seated himself to begin to teach, kind of like the rabbis would. And he began to teach the multitude. We most often refer to this teaching as the Sermon on the Mount, teaching which was revolutionary and transformative, as we're going to see as we study through this. The first thing he's going to talk about is what we refer to as the Beatitudes, Matthew 5, 3 through 12, and Luke 6, 20 through 23. Jesus begins to beautifully teach this sermon by pronouncing blessings which await those that are righteous. And we affectionately call this section the Beatitudes. And let's notice the first three in Matthew 5, 3 through 5. We spent a whole quarter on that or more, talking about the blessings. But we're going to spend a lot less time on that today. But anyway, it begins in Matthew 5, 3 through 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And that is, in just those few words, a wow moment. Let me turn back so you can kind of see where we're going from here. Watch those verses. Now, perhaps you have heard, and I guess I've probably even taught this in the past, heard preachers or teachers substitute the word happy for blessed or blessed. You see, being happy or unhappy is an emotion that is based upon our circumstances at the time. And I'm convinced there's a better word than happy. And these, as you notice, since happy is based upon circumstances, you'll notice that these Beatitudes are obviously filled with a lot of circumstance. And I submit that the best word to substitute for blessed is the word joyful, which is not based upon our circumstances. Even when we are unhappy, Christians can be joyful, remain joyful. And each of these Beatitudes will characterize unhappy circumstances that Christians are called upon to remain joyful. Verse 3 says that the poor in spirit should be blessed or joyful. The poor in spirit are those who recognize their need for spiritual help. In their humility, they are willing to submit their own will to the will of God, which is not always a comfortable circumstance for people to do, to submit their will to God. And in their obedience to God, they can rejoice that they become part of that earthly kingdom, the church, the body of the saved, and heirs to a heavenly home. We should note probably Luke 6 and verse 20 says, blessed are you poor, instead of poor in spirit. And I really don't see a contradiction there, because the poor in this world's belongings tend to be more humble and more receptive to the riches that God offers. Jesus says in verse 4 that those that mourn should be joyful. You know, we mourn. We mourn over the loss of loved ones. We mourn over lost relationships. And we sometimes mourn even over lost possessions. And these instances are not happy circumstances. We're not in a happy circumstance now with members of our congregation and those that we have lost. we mourn for those people. Yet if we have fellowship with Christ our Lord, we can be joyful in knowing that he will eventually give peace to our heavy laden soul. Luke 6:21 says, "Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh." And then verse 5 says that the meek shall be joyful. The meek are those who are willing to bear injury or injustice, and they do it with patience. And Paul is a good example of one who endured much physical abuse with much patience. And he knew that God would vindicate him. That was the reason he was able to do it. He was meek. And the meek can remain joyful because they have God's sure promise that an abundant inheritance awaits them if they patiently endure. And I think those three Beatitudes are wow teaching for sure. Now notice the Beatitudes in Matthew 5, 6 through 8. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God." Again, wow teaching from the mouth of Jesus. Jesus says in verse 6, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, because they should remain joyful." These are people who diligently seek to learn the gospel of Christ. They seek to learn what it says and to live out those teachings righteously. And then they eagerly obey what they have learned. The expression hunger and thirst indicates that this search is not always a comfortable experience. But we can certainly rejoice in knowing that Jesus has promised to satisfy diligent seekers with righteousness if they will be diligent seekers. Jesus says in verse 7 that those who show mercy to their fellow man should be joyful. For in so doing, they will obtain mercy from God. Being merciful to those who have sinned against us is obviously not a real easy thing to do. It kind of goes against our human nature. We want to respond in kind. Yet if we are to receive God's mercy for our sins, to receive his forgiveness, we must be willing to forgive those who sin against us. When we develop that kind of mindset, we can be joyful in forgiving others and receiving the forgiveness of God because we have forgiven others. In verse 8, Jesus says that those who maintain a pure heart should be joyful, for they shall see God. You know, it's difficult enough to keep our actions correct, yet it's substantially more difficult to keep our thoughts and our motives and our principles just as pure as our actions. Man judges us based on our outward appearances. He judges us on the things that we do, our actions. But God looks upon our heart. He looks upon our thoughts and our motives and our principles. Therefore, those who strive to maintain purity of heart can rejoice, because one day they will see God and they will dwell with him for an eternity. In verse 9, Jesus says that those who fill the role of peacemaker should also be joyful, for they shall be called the sons of God. Perhaps one of the most uncomfortable jobs a Christian can perform is to mediate peace between parties who are disputing with one another. It may be disputes between a husband and wife, between a parent and a child, between siblings, or it could be a neighbor against a neighbor. Someone once said that no man is more like God than when he is a peacemaker. And Jesus pronounces peacemakers as joyful because they are worthy to be called the sons and daughters of God. Wow. Again, beautiful teaching. Any comments before we continue?
Question. I think it's verse 8. They shall see God. How is that? Anybody got a different outlook on that? Does that mean they will one day see God in heaven, or does that mean that they can see God for who He is now?
Well, I think it specifically is talking about see God in heaven. But what you say is perfectly correct. You know, they can see God in the things around them as they believe and their faith becomes stronger. They can see God in what's happening. That's what you're saying, right?
Yes, sir, because it says the pure in heart. Well, the more pure we become, the closer to our Father we become, obviously.
Sure. Any other comments? Yeah, I think they're going to see God. He says a guarantee of salvation, which is the first thing we talked about. Any other comments? Okay. Let's go on to, let's see. There we go. Let's go on to Matthew 5, look at verses 10 through 12. It says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." You know, the persecution of a Christian because of his faith in God, we see it taking many forms, and it mentions a few here. It can involve ridicule, which is most of the persecution that I have taken in the past. Ridicule for expressing your beliefs. Or it may involve people telling lies about you to harm your status in life. It may even involve physical abuse, up to and including death, as in the case of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. And while persecution is immensely uncomfortable, we can rejoice in the promise that heaven will be our home and great will be our reward if we will patiently endure that persecution. And that is certainly wow teaching. Just a little note here, Luke 6:22 says, "Blessed are you when men hate you and when they exclude you and revile you and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake." So Luke throws a few more things of persecution that we must endure. Okay, any comments on any of the Beatitudes before we go on to? If not, we're going to the section where Jesus is pronouncing woes. And this is only found in Luke 6:24 through 26. The Gospel of Luke gives us some of Jesus' teaching that is omitted in Matthew. Some commentators believe that these woes may have been specifically directed at the Pharisees who have probably been lurking in the crowd that Jesus is teaching to. Now, woe means misery or distress or grief. And notice the reading in Luke 6:24 through 26. "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets." It would be reasonable to look at these woes as being specifically placed on the Pharisees. But for our purposes this morning, I want to approach each one of them separately. The first woe is placed on those who are rich in this world's possessions. The rich diligently seek and love their possessions, and they find consolation in them. Yet by trusting in their riches, they quite often believe in their own self-sufficiency, and they think they can live independently of God. And all the consolation that they have reason to expect in life, they have already received in their riches. Yet their consolation is only temporary and will be followed by misery and grief, according to Jesus. He says, woe to the rich. The second woe is placed on those who are full or satisfied with their wealth, and they have no desire to seek for those things of a spiritual nature. But the time will come when their wealth will be diminished or no longer brings them satisfaction. Then they will hunger. They're going to hunger for something better. But they will not know where to find that something better, because all they know is striving for riches. The third woe is placed on those who laugh. In other words, those who are happy, thoughtless, and unserious, all of those together. The time will eventually come when they will experience great sorrow, and they will mourn and weep. It may be because of sickness, may be because of calamity, the death of a loved one, or their own approaching death, and they have nowhere to turn for consolation. Circumstances will eventually turn their mirth to misery. They'll turn their laughter to woe. Wayne, would you look up 2 Timothy 4, 2 through 4? In just a moment, I want him to read that for us. But the fourth woe is placed on those who receive the praise of all men. If all men speak well of you in what you are teaching, there is a high likelihood that you are not necessarily teaching the truth. Even the Jewish fathers praised the false teachers because they told them what they wanted to hear. And that's found in Jeremiah 5 in verse 31. And of course, that is a wow moment. Okay, now Wayne, read 2 Timothy 4, 2 through 4.
Preach the word, be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all longsuffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables.
Okay, so talking about people kind of fickle. They don't really strive for the truth as much as they want a teacher who will teach them what they want to hear. And that is in 2 Timothy, that tells us to still preach the word. Still preach the word, no matter what. Okay. Yep. Sure. The woes or which one?
Yeah, the woes about being rich in verse 24. I mean, that's, the way it's worded is kind of deceiving because, of course, it makes it sound, I think we probably know anyway, but it makes it sound like if you're rich, you've got your reward, you're lost. You know, it kind of makes it sound like that, and I think if you couple, you know, that with Matthew 19, with that account, verse 24 and following, that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, that passage, and they say, well, who in the world can be saved is what his disciples said, and he said, with man it's impossible, but with God all things are possible. So that indicates that, of course, you can be saved and still be wealthy. And then you look at 1 Timothy 6, verses 9 and following, where it talks about, the desire to be rich. It all has to do with priorities in heart. So if our heart is right with God and we put Him first, of course you can be wealthy. I mean, the emphasis there is, where's your priorities? Where's your love? Where's your passion? Just wanted to bring that out because it's kind of confusing to read that, especially if you don't know the other teachings on it.
Yeah, it's talking about, it may have should have said, but woe to you who are rich and depend only on the riches.
Yeah, it would be a little bit clearer, I guess, if it did that.
Yeah.
Because here it just makes it sound like, well, you have your consolation. You better not be rich because you're not going to be rich eternally if you are. And that's not what it's saying. In Matthew 19, of course, he's emphasizing how hard it is to be a wealthy person and to be right with God, because it's so easy to put our focus, our attention, our love, or all of that, on those things instead of God.
Yeah, and we got to realize as Christians that we are rich people.
Yeah.
America is a rich nation. And there's not a one of us here that can't say that we have lots of material possessions. So we got to be careful. We got to be careful ourselves. Okay, let's go on before the bell rings. Believers are salt and light. And that comes from Matthew 5:13 through 16. That's where we'll be concentrating our message on. As Jesus continues his Sermon on the Mount, let's notice Matthew 5:13. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. Now, in the Beatitudes we have just studied, Jesus has been describing to his followers many of the characteristics that they should add to their lives. These are attributes which will help each disciple to develop a Christ-like character and to be personally upright. But personal uprightness is really just a starting point. Now they must display those attributes to the world, and they must be an influence for good to those around them. Jesus tells his disciples in Matthew 5:13 that they should be the salt of the earth. Now, salt is a flavoring that makes food palatable. When you think that the food is not tasting like it should, quite often we reach for the salt shaker for it to add some flavor. And the Christian must also be like that. They must also be a beneficial seasoning. They must be a Christ-like influence to their circle of friends and their acquaintances. But if the Christian loses his saltiness, his Christ-like influence, he is good for nothing to the Savior. And he might as well be thrown out and trampled underfoot of men. Now notice what Jesus says in Matthew 5:14 through 16. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a bushel, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. In addition to salt, Jesus gives 3 analogies about light that depict the essential influence of the Christian. First, it says we must be the light of the world, that first phrase. Everywhere we go, in everything that we do, everyone we meet must be able to observe the light of Christ that our lives should be reflecting. Second, we must be like a city that is set on a hill, that it cannot be hidden. Now, I'm sure you've experienced it when you're driving late at night and you're approaching a large city. Quite often you're able to see the lights of that city many miles before you get there. Our Christian light must always be set at its brightest intensity so that when we interact with our community, it can be readily seen. As disciples of Christ, we cannot afford to take any days off. We must continue to let our light shine. And the third analogy is that it is laughable to light a candle and put it under a bushel. Instead, that lit candle must be placed on a candlestick so that it gives light to all those who are in our home. You know, maybe the most important place to let our light shine is in our homes, for our children to see, our grandchildren to see. Inconsistent living and unconfessed sin will most likely be known in our homes if that is the case. And we will be like a basket being placed over our light. Let us resolve to always let our light shine brightly in our homes for the whole family to see and to be influenced for good, hopefully. And that certainly is a wow moment. That is one of my favorite passages that Jesus teaches, is this one little section right here, Matthew 5:14 through 16. So as the salt of the earth and the light of the world, the Christian is obligated to maintain his character so that his Christ-like influence on those around him will be just as strong as it possibly can be. That is why Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, let your light, if you want to boil it down to one verse, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. Okay, the next section is Christ fulfills the law and the prophets, Matthew 5:17 through 20. Jesus makes known here his relationship to the law and to the prophets. And notice what he says in Matthew 5:17. Do not think that I came, I should have that, yep. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. We know that Jesus was already meeting with severe opposition in his ministry from the scribes and Pharisees in particular. And because of this opposition from the religious leaders of his day, many in his audience may have thought that Jesus came to destroy the law. But Jesus makes it clear that he did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill that law. In verse 18, Jesus says that one jot or tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. In other words, the smallest parts of the law and the prophets, the jot or the tittle, will remain until all of it is fulfilled and is accomplished. Accomplished where? Accomplished in the life and the sufferings of Jesus. The law served as a shadow of good things that were to come in Christ. Hebrews 10 in verse 1. And the shadow of those repetitive sacrifices in the law were fulfilled when Jesus offered himself once for the sins of many. Hebrews 9 in verse 28. Also, the prophets contained many predictions of the coming Messiah, and these too were fulfilled in the birth, the death, the life and the death and burial and resurrection of Jesus. And that is certainly a wow moment, that all these things were accomplished in Jesus.
In Luke 24:44, he says, all this is now accomplished. He said, what was written in the law, the prophets, and Psalms concerning me has now been fulfilled.
Is now accomplished. Wasn't accomplished here, but it was going to be, for sure. In verse 19, Jesus admonishes his audience to obey all the commandments of the law, even the least of the commandments, and to teach others to do the same. Those who do this would be deemed worthy of his kingdom. It seems that the Pharisees had been teaching that there were greater and lesser commandments in the law. But Jesus declares that anyone who teaches that any of the laws of God are so small that they need not be obeyed they would not be worthy to be in his kingdom. Jesus sums up his teaching in Matthew 5 and verse 20, which I have on the screen. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. The righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees was at best external in nature. It consisted of outward observances of ceremonial law and traditional law. It did not proceed from the heart. So Jesus admonishes his audience to exceed their righteousness and to strive to be pure and holy in heart. Otherwise, they would not be fit subjects for his kingdom. And that is a wow moment. Any comments? Okay. I'm going to introduce you to what's going to happen next week because we didn't finish today. I still have about 10 minutes left. But next week, we're going to begin by looking at 6 illustrations that Jesus makes, where he contrasts the outward demands of the law to the inward attitudes of the heart. So he's going to contrast the law, the old law, to what he wants his new law to be. So that's what we're going to begin next week looking at. Thanks.